This is my first official meeting. I am very excited and very nervous. I almost wore my cowgirl hat today and a badge because there's a new sheriff in town. So things are going to be a little different today. You'll notice it. I'm going to explain some things along the way. But I don't believe in being a dinosaur. I want us to continue to evolve and grow and learn and see what works and what doesn't, and take you guys all on this journey with me and my team. But to start us off, we need our invocation, our pledge, and our anthem. And I invite my good friend and my mentor throughout the years, Milton Little, to the stage.
Thank you. Thank you, President Stephanie. It's good to see all of you here, and I am honored that she asked me to do this today. And so I haven't sung a solo in public since I was in 6th grade, so I'm only singing the first couple of words of the anthem, so we'll get to that in a second. But I hope all of you join with me in wishing Stephanie great success and pledging all we can do to make sure that we are part of that success. So bow your heads, please. O Creator, you've given all people one common origin, and you desire to gather us into one family. You've given us eyes, ears, hearts, and minds with which to understand and respond to the needs of our sisters and brothers, especially the children. Sometimes the limits that we place on our patience and compassion lead us to turn away from their suffering or scoff at their plight, saying, if only they would, or why can't they just? The limits we place on our patience and compassion lead us to want simple solutions. Heavenly Father, remind us that our professional successes say that we are built to solve complex problems. You ordered our steps into Rotary not just to fellowship, but to listen, to learn, to reflect, and to act. Empower us with your love to seek the common good for everyone, regardless of their race, class, profession, gender, sexual orientation, or their political views. And remind us that those are not how you define character or worth. Give us the wisdom of mind and generosity of heart to seek your will and work to ensure that every man, woman, and child might live in dignity, peace, and justice. Finally, bless the food placed before us, the hands that prepared it, and those who serve it. May it provide the nourishment necessary to do your good works. We ask these and other blessings in your name. Amen. Please join me in the Pledge of Allegiance. I pledge allegiance to the flag of the United States of America and to the republic for which it stands, one nation, under God, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all. And now the national anthem. Oh, say, can you see by the dawn's early light what so proudly we hailed at the twilight's last gleaming, whose broad stripes and bright stars through the perilous fight o'er the ramparts we watched were so gallantly streaming, and the rockets' red glare, the bombs bursting in air, gave proof through the night that our flag was still there. Oh, say does that star-spangled banner yet wave o'er the land of the free and the home of the brave? It's all yours.
We sounded pretty darn good, I think. So we have a lot. You may be seated. We have a lot of guests here today, too many to name, and I want to thank those of you who came on my behalf today. But if you are a guest of a Rotarian today, could you please stand so we can acknowledge you? Thank you. We also have, we'll get Joel back to his station. We had a lot of July birthdays, but we weren't here for the 4th, so we didn't do it last week. But here's the list of all of the July birthdays. And as just a housekeeping reminder, your attendance QR code is on the table, and I'm going to add a new one. Could you just check your phones and see if they are set to silent? That would be great. After today's meeting, you will be able to pick up the brand new rosters. We ask that you limit those to 1 per member as well. And then next, before we go into new members, I'm going to explain why we're doing things a little differently today. And that is because, is Randall here today? Randall is here. Okay, first, Randall, can you stand up? I want to acknowledge Randall and the amazing job he and his team have done with getting us new members. It has been awesome. However, we have an embarrassment of riches, thanks to Randall and his team's work, and we have a backlog of new members. So we're going to change things up about how we do new members. We're going to be doing 2 per meeting. And although we have trusted all of you in the past with the 2-minute limit, we have failed miserably in the execution of that. Some of you, if we give you a mic, you love it. So I am taking the mics from you, and I will be introducing our new members along with their sponsors, and we are going to start that today. So I would first like to invite Tyler Courtney and his sponsor, John O'Neill, to the stage. I was teasing Tyler, because you notice I said sponsor, not sponsors. And I was teasing Tyler that something about him seems to have made his other 2 sponsors leave the club, which is in fact what has happened. Two out of his original 3 sponsors, for various reasons, are no longer with us at Rotary. Thank goodness John O'Neill still is. But I would tell you a little bit about Tyler. He was born and raised in Telluride, Colorado. He had 28 other people in his graduating class, so definitely small town. Attended Duke University, and then went on to Emory at the Goethe School for his MBA. He is on the board of the Midtown Alliance and the Atlanta Ronald McDonald House Charities, the Woodruff Corporate Cabinet, and remains active with Duke and Emory. His full bio is on the screen. He has been with Cushman & Wakefield for 10 years and took over as managing principal of the Atlanta office from our past president, John O'Neill. John is still with Cushman. He just keeps going up the ladder at Cushman. But Tyler loves to camp, hike, and fly fish. So if any of you are interested in those activities, you can see Tyler. An interesting fact about Tyler, he participated in an event called 29029. I'm not sure what that means. You'll have to tell us, Tyler.
It's the vertical equivalent of Mount Everest.
So he hiked up a ski mountain in Vermont 17 times in 36 hours to reach that vertical equivalent of Mount Everest. So Tyler, we want to welcome you to the Rotary Club of Atlanta, 5th largest in the world, but number 1 in terms of being the best one. Thank you, and welcome to Rotary. Thank you, John. And next up on the stage, Meredith Lackey. And Meredith's sponsors are Beverly Daniel Tatum, Chris Womack, and Shan Cooper. Are any of her sponsors here today? It's just me and you, girl.
Just us.
So Meredith started her career as a private practice lawyer specialized in complex litigation. In my mind, all litigation is complex, but hers was a specialty there. She moved in-house almost 20 years ago at the North American headquarters of global mining company, Emrys. Is that how you say that? Then later served as general counsel for two major intercompanies, first Colonial Pipeline and then Georgia Power. She has also served in a number of non-legal roles, including human resources, compliance, and now external affairs at Georgia Power. So she oversees governmental affairs, regulatory affairs, region external affairs, environmental affairs, price and planning, economic development, and corporate communications. That is a lot, as well as the infamous Georgia Power Nuclear Development Team, which is supporting Vogtle. That may be a whole program in and of itself. She has her undergraduate degree from LSU in business and a law degree from Ole Miss. And one of the fun facts about Meredith, if any of you are having travel plans and need a travel planner, Meredith has become a bit of an expert planning 5 countries.
So last-minute travel.
Last-minute travel. She's an expert at having planned 5 countries in less than a month. We ask what she is most proud of and what is her biggest challenge, and that is being mom to 2 teenage daughters. So having been a teenage daughter and having a teenage daughter, I can say yes, that is. So we also welcome you to the Rotary Club of Atlanta and look forward to your membership with us. Thank you. So before you keep eating, I'm going to ask you to do something for just a second. I'm going to ask you to turn to the folks at your table and shake their hand. Introduce yourselves if you don't know them. Okay. Thank you all for saying hello to everyone. Now you're going to have more opportunity to have conversation in a few minutes. But this is going to become a standard practice. Too often we sit down at our tables, we sit next to someone we know, and we don't reach out and introduce ourselves. Now I'm going to go off script here for a second. Bob Hope, where's Bob Hope? You have to come up here. Well, he did do something, and I'm going to let him explain why. Because I have a really hard time with doing things for myself, about myself, whatever. So Bob did something on his own and needs to explain why he did, because he put something at each of your tables. Because I wasn't going to do this, but Bob did. So he can explain why he did. Here, come on up. Just come on up. And the 2-minute rule applies to you, too.
Let me pull out my speech. No, a couple of years ago at the Community Champion Awards, Stephanie won the award, but she also gave a very nice speech. And it was so nice, and it was on such a relevant topic that the decision was made to reprint it and leave it as a gift for everyone who came the next year. And the speech was on the importance of kindness. And, and it is important. I mean, kindness is really, I think, kindness is what makes us all get along with each other. And so today, I just thought for our first day, we had some speeches left over, and we had a couple of boxes, and we brought them and put them at your table. And I would encourage all of you to read it, because I think after you read it, You'll understand why Stephanie is such a kind person, and you'll be a much kinder person. So that's it.
Thanks, Bob. And thanks to our friends at Christian City who were kind enough to print that for us. So Bob mentioned about kindness, and really that starts at home, and it starts by what you were raised with. So I want to thank my mom and dad for driving all the way down here in the Atlanta traffic that they hate so much. My mom said she was so stressed out because these trucks kept going too fast past them. But they came down here to be in support of me. My kids are out doing their thing, their internships, their work, so they couldn't be here today, but my mom and dad were. So, and I'm probably making my mom cry. And I want to thank Tommy Holder, who was my sponsor in 2016, for believing in me as a Rotarian, even though I didn't at the time fit the mold. I was not a business person. I wasn't running an organization. I was just involved in a whole lot of stuff. And Tommy believed in me and took that chance. And Bill Todd believed in me to become a Rotary president. And so did Dave Moody. And Dave is part of the reason I'm up here today, is Dave called me and said, I want you to be my program chair. And I said, okay, what does that mean? He said, it means you're in charge of the programs. And I said, well, can you give me a little more? He said, yeah, this is easy. This is a piece of cake. You got this. Not only was it the year the pandemic hit, but it was probably the hardest job I've ever had in my life. David Lewis, you're next. But it was also such an amazing opportunity, and I thank Dave for giving me the chance to do that good work that year. And he has been a great friend and mentor too, which is why he's there. But I wanted to take a minute to introduce my team for the year. I'm going to start with David Lewis. Will you stand? David Lewis is the program chair, being supported by David Rubinger. Pat Upshaw Monteith and Dan Gordon. Our membership, Pat is leading us, Dan is supporting her. Keith Parker is the VP of Community Service, but Keith is on vacation. Tom Chubb, I don't know if Tom Chubb's here today. He's our sergeant at arms. He's going to be in charge of corralling everyone to get us in on time. Kathy Waller, the amazing Kathy Waller, is our treasurer again this year. Claire Stirk is our VP of International and District Service. Claire's in the back there. Wab Kadaba is our secretary this year. And then finally, we have Gary Reedy, who is our VP of Club Service and Engagement. So this is team common ground for the common good for 22-23. So if you guys have questions, look at these faces, go to them as well. They're all on the screen too. But I want to thank my team for committing early and being engaged with us, and look forward to a really exciting and fun year. You guys can sit down now. So some of you have heard, and in fact, I'd already gotten an email about this year in Rotary and my theme. And I'm actually not going to talk about my theme today. I'm going to talk about it at the next meeting, because we've got some work to do today before I want to address that. And the theme is finding common ground for the common good. We all know that these are divisive and polarized times. But I've been reading a lot about the history of Rotary and the opportunity that I have in front of me. And when Bill Todd emailed me, I told him I was both humbled and frightened, honestly, of the responsibility that comes with leading this organization, but I was also so excited about the opportunity, about what we get to talk about, and not only talk about, but what we get to do. And the founder of Rotary, Paul Harris, said that whatever Rotary may mean to us, to the world, it will be known by the results it achieves. Now, that's what Paul Harris said, and we know, many of us know about the service above self motto. The one I didn't really understand was the one about one profits most, who serves best. That's our other motto that was adopted. It used to be, he who profits most serves best. It was amended I believe in the early 2000s. But we have an opportunity within this club. Every one of you is a leader, whether it's in your respective field, in your community, wherever it may be. And the ripple effects of what we not only learn, but what we do influence what happens to not only our city, but our state as well. It is not a responsibility that we will take lightly this year. David and I have committed that every speaker that we will bring before you this year will offer you insights in not only how the world is functioning, but also how we can serve it better, how we can be better business people, how we can be better leaders, how we can be more effective in the work that we want to all accomplish together. And I have made David promise me that no one will be boring. That is my key thing. Nobody can be boring. So hopefully, each Rotary meeting will be a conversation of sorts. We will listen, we will reflect, we will participate, we will engage, we will problem solve, and we will create solutions that move us forward. Now, I have seen many of you see the facilitator card on your table and start passing it around, right? Because you don't want to be the facilitator. We're not going to shy away from hard work in this club. We can do hard things. Anybody who's read Glennon Doyle's book knows what I mean by that. But we have work to do at the end of today's meeting that will shape where we go for the rest of the year. And I only ask for 3 things from you for this whole year. It's the 3 C's. It's funny, Fred, I had my 3 C's and you've got your C's. But mine are compassion, which is a form of kindness, curiosity, and courage. Can we have compassion for each other in the room, as well as the folks that we will hear about in the issues they face? Can we have curiosity about these issues and set aside what we think we know as opposed to what we don't really know? And can we have the courage to admit that maybe we're wrong about some of the things that we thought we knew? And can we be brave enough to stand up for the new information that we have in a way that will help transform the lives of those who maybe aren't as lucky? Compassion, curiosity, and courage. Those are the 3 C's that I want to lead us forward as we find common ground for the common good. But we can't do that unless we know how to talk to each other. So part of what I wrote in the email out to everyone was the headline of, "Can we talk?" And whether or not that makes you cringe or whether you lean into that. But the ability for us to be able to sit at the table together and have a conversation is going to be key to coming to some consensus on some of the topics that we're going to face, because we are going to dive into some things that are going to be difficult this year and maybe a little scary and a little off-putting. But with your guidance, and that's part of your work today, we're going to do this together and we're going to make a difference. So I met Fred through my dear friend Wanya Lucas. They served on the NPR board together and the Sundance Festival as well. Fred used to lead the team at IDEO, which has helped countless organizations around the globe come up with the best thinking possible and new and innovative ideas. I'm not going to read all of Fred's bio because I want him to get up here and talk. But Fred became convinced that there was a better way in making conversations and came up with kind of 7 keys to how we do make better conversation. So I'm going to invite Fred to the stage. We're starting earlier than we normally do. That is not an excuse to leave as soon as Fred finishes, because the work will occur after. I've heard from many of you in the club that very often we hear a great speaker and we have no time to sit and talk about it as a club and what this has meant. So that's where the note cards come in today. So Fred is going to kick us off with about a 10-minute talk. He and I are going to get together on the stage to go over some more meaty questions, and then you guys get to do the work at your table. So please welcome my friend Fred Dust.
with Stephanie because I met her at dinner. I don't know. Oh, I met her at dinner. Was it 2 years ago, basically? And we had the most open and honest conversation so quickly. So I think she'll be a good steward of conversation for you guys as we go forward. I will tell you that when I do talks, and the name of my book is Making Conversation, and people are always like, really? Do I have to? Do I have to learn how to have conversations? And the sad news for you is, yes, we actually need to learn, and we need to relearn how to have hard conversations, and that's what we're gonna talk about today. To give a little bit of background to the book's kind of was given birth to around 2017. I woke up one morning, there had been a massive shooting in Las Vegas. I think somewhat around 50 people were killed. Got dressed, went to work, went to meetings, did everything I needed to do, and midday realized that one of my colleagues had been killed in the shooting, and that I hadn't even stopped in the morning to process what had happened that morning in the news. How often do you find that you get hit by something in a news hook that you just say, I'm not gonna think about that now, I have to think about this? People, does that happen, right? Every single time we don't have a conversation about something that strikes us in a significant way as individuals, we lose the opportunity to understand each other better and make the conversations that matter most to us as leaders, as family members, as friends and communities. So what we're gonna talk about today is how do we make conversation a little bit easier, a little bit funner, We'll make it a little funner. It's like a little funnier. I promise that I'll keep it like light as possible, but I thought I'd start with this scary slide. So this is like what we grapple with daily. And one of the things I ask myself is like, where do we turn to find great examples of, we might have to go to the next slide, of conversations that allow us to heal. And one of the things I looked at was mourning. So this is actually sitting Shiva. It's a Jewish practice of kind of 7 days, all in black, people lie low and like sit on the ground and talk about the person who they've lost and then come out into the world afterwards and announce that they're open to kind of embrace the world again. These kinds of practices are things that allow us to have conversations that give us the time to pause and think about the things that matter. And these are the kinds of conversations that we've increasingly just cut out of our lives. We've removed the moments to pause. And pause is our greatest tool to having good, contemplative, thoughtful conversation. Interestingly, when I started looking into the mourning habits, mourning across culture is more similar than different, which is interesting. Like, what's really intriguing to me is when you start to look at rituals that go cross-cultural, you start to say there are rules and tricks and tips that we can pull from that to have harder conversations and make them feel more natural, more comfortable. So I often say dialogue is our oldest tool. It's our oldest, least lethal tool, and we're doing really poorly at it. So how do we get better at it? Quick, really short story. When I sold the book, you go to meet with your publisher, the publisher meets with you in like this kind of fancy restaurant. They say all these amazing things like, hey, the book is yours, no matter what, do what you want, we're totally not gonna touch it. And I was like, yeah, this is great. And they're like, this is awesome. So it's like, we love the book. Oh, my publisher stops me and she says, but the reality is you wrote a book that was entirely about how we lost conversation in the world. And I was like, I know, I can't wait, it's done, it's all researched. And she's like, yeah, but we don't need that book. We need a book about how to reinvent and rebuild conversation in America. And I was like, well, that's a different book. And she was like, I know, it's the book we need. So what was funny is suddenly what was supposed to be like 9 months ended up being a 2-year process of me going out into the world to sort of see interesting examples of people who led hard conversations. And at first I started like really significant things like going to meet the Dalai Lama and stuff like that. Not so interesting, there wasn't that much to pull from it. I mean, he's a great guy, but just like not for us, daily, not so much. Went on pilgrimage, which is really interesting. If, most cultures have a form of pilgrimage, whether it's climbing a mountain, like 16 times during a day, it's a kind of that's a pilgrimage, right? And then often when you go on these kinds of like structured walks, you have certain kinds of relationships you build. So looked at practices like that, looked at religion, a lot of really interesting examples in the religious space of how conversations can happen, and really started to kind of get inspired about how we can actually make conversation happen again. And then we did practice, tried conversations, tried hard conversations. And I'm gonna talk to you about some of the things, the tools that we use in the work that we do. It's called The Creative Palette. These are the 7 chapters of the book. First one is commitment. Hopefully, Stephanie, you and I will talk about that at the end because I think it's one of the most important of the palettes. But I'm going to give you a couple examples of like some of the things that pop up in the different chapters and things to watch for in the conversations you have so that then we can stop and just have a group conversation. The first thing I write about, or chapter 2, is creative listening. And I want to just kind of start by sort of saying, we've gotten really bad at listening, and I mean it in like the fundamental way. When we think about listening, we often relate it to work. So people will say things like, you see this with a new leader, a new boss who comes in who says, I'm just going to give everybody a good listening to. What does that sound like? I'm going to give everybody a good listening to. That does not sound good. That does not sound fun. That sounds like it's actually a form of punishment. We often do this. You hear politicians like, they had no choice but just to sit and listen. We make listening sound like a punishment, when in fact listening is our greatest, most joyful, greatest creative skill that we have. So we lose the opportunity to kind of really participate when we don't listen with our full bodies and our full minds. One of the biggest issues in listening is a mechanism called active listening. Do people have this? Do they come across this in their workplace? It's this kind of notion that like you nod and you kind of like move along and kind of say, yes, that's a great idea. Interestingly, that was born out of therapy. It was a response to Freudian therapy in the 60s. A therapist was like, I'm never going to be able to figure out what's wrong with these people. The only way it's going to work is if they figure it out themselves. So he built this thing called Rogerian therapy, which was in fact active listening. That was mostly like, I'm going to sit and listen to you, and I'm going to nod and say, yes, that's it, go on, and then you're going to solve your own problems. And I'm not going to do anything. I'm just going to keep encouraging you. Interestingly, we took that method, that mechanism, and we put it right into the heart of the workplace. It's actually the language of most HR right now, is that actually we teach active listening. Just nod, let them talk. You don't necessarily have to agree, but it's that, by the way, is just not listening. It's just sitting there and nodding. It looks nice. The problem is it just doesn't give what you need out of a listening context. So one of the things I was looking at is like, well, where does listening happen in an interesting way? I looked at Quaker meetings. I don't know if anyone's been to a Quaker meeting. One of the things I love about Quaker meetings is you start in a Quaker meeting and you start in silence. So you basically have to sit for 20 minutes. For those of you who might not know, Quakers actually were the first to let women have property rights in the 1600s. They believe that anybody can have testimony. Everyone can hear the voice of God. So every meeting in Quaker meetings is you start by listening to yourself for the first 20 minutes. You just hear what you have to say until you might or might not feel moved to stand up and speak. But what's interesting is when somebody's speaking, when they're testifying, you, the other people in the room who are listening, you're not just like, oh yeah, what that person's saying is awesome, it's so right. You're also listening to yourself and you're saying, not so much, don't buy this. It actually asks you to be judgy. And this is one of the first lessons of listening, is that we think we're supposed to be not judgmental when we listen. The problem is it's innate. We judge. That's who we are. The thing we have to get good at is not holding on to our judgments. We have to actually be willing to let the judgments go. So whenever you're sort of like, one of the big defense mechanisms we have about listening is like, well, I don't want to hear something that's going to make me feel judgy and I'll feel bad about it. It's just human nature to do that. And so what I love about Quaker listening is that it requires you to be listening. It requires you to be judgy. It's part of what you're supposed to be listening to when you hear testimony. I also really believe in asking people to tell compelling stories. So I have a practice, I'm just going to go quickly through this, Stephanie, because we'll talk about this in greater detail, called Illuminations. I really wanted to look at who in my life told the best stories and looked all around the world and came back to my great-grandmother. And my great-grandmother was this phenomenal storyteller. She was so good. And she had these kind of tricks. But so you would sit with her every evening in the rocking chair or in the kind of swing, and she would tell you a story. And one of the stories I'll never forget that she told me was about coming home from the steel mill. She worked in the steel mill at night and as a farmer by day, and she was walking exhausted. She was like, I just want to lay down my load and die. And she's walking up the road to the farm, and she sees this blue thing coming out of the sky, and it kind of gravitates and comes closer and closer and closer until she realizes it's Jesus, and he winks at her, and she has the power to go on. That is, in my mind, one of the best stories ever. And partially because she does all the kind of like great things that great storytellers do. The story's really short. It's no more than 25 seconds. It ends right where it begins. You don't learn anything more, right? You don't know, did she invite Jesus in for coffee? Like, what happened? It was just more. Jesus was there, he winked, that was it. It's like, it's a story that makes you want to show up tomorrow to hear what your grandmother has to say at the same time, at the same hour. Like, it gets you hooked. But it also reveals stuff about her. It teaches you that she was a hard worker, that she was Christian, that she really had faith, and that kind of led her forward. And that's the kind of stories I want us to start to pull from each other. Stories that kind of allow us to understand our true values, the things that matter to us, and allow us to do it in a way that doesn't necessarily make us want to judge them for it, that makes you want to kind of understand them, live in compassion with them. So you can ask and learn. In fact, I write about exactly how to tell those kinds of stories and how to ask for those kinds of stories. They make listening way more engaging. I want to talk about clarity. Actually, I'm going to skip this one because I want to make sure. No, I'm not going to skip this one. So one of the things that I believe is actually really significant is that we often have beliefs about what the definitions are of words or terms or what they mean that may or may not be right. And everyone in the room, does anyone know the word triage, right? So when you go into an emergency room, rooms that rely on triage, if you canvass the people in the emergency room and say, what's triage? About half the people in the room can tell you what triage is. Triage, if you don't know, came from the idea of separating coffee from the French, and then basically was used in trench warfare in 1914 as a way to kind of look at whether people need to go into emergency care or not. And it's still the word we use when you go into an emergency room and say, oh, you need to go through immediately, you don't. But if you don't know the word triage, you're missing a whole step in the process. And very often, we use language that purposefully hides the things that actually we need to be most clear and most frank and open. Often we do that, especially in corporate contexts. We love, our favorite form of this is basically when we use letters instead of words, when you'll have stacks and stacks of letters, and that's basically meant to stand for something. And it's so we build jargon and we become really proud of jargon. The problem is that holds us out of conversations in critical moments. And so one of the things that I really ask you guys as a group to think about is really think about the terms of what you're using. What do they mean? An example that I had that was really upsetting was during the Sandy Hook hearings, where I was brought to some hearings in the White House, and everybody would say, this is a meeting on gun violence, or gun control, or gun something, but everybody had different definitions for what the meeting was, and by not getting to kind of common agreement on what we were talking about, we never got to even get to the end of the conversation. It was all a conversation about terms, and that's the kind of conversation that will sink us so fast, where we're just sitting and talking about terms. So if you can, agree to terms up front. I'm going to ask you to take a quick pause, just reflect on this. I think it'll relate back, Stephanie, to what you're going to do later, which is just, are there phrases or words or concepts that make you uncomfortable, that make you feel like there are things that you might not want to talk about? You don't have to write them down, you don't have to say them right now, but I want to think about that, because one of the questions I often have with those things is it because we don't have clarity around it? Do we have a group and collective clarity around it? And so we want to look to how we can actually kind of find clarity around the terms that really matter to us. One of the things that's embedded in a conversation is that there's rules. There's implicit rules and explicit rules. Explicit rules can be nothing goes out of this room, right? Or the agenda is a set of rules. But then there's implicit rules. And we need to kind of be careful of the implicit rules and whether or not we want to be guided by them. And so one of the things I really like to have people do is practice noticing rules in a conversation, and then with those rules sort of saying, what if we reset those rules? What if we change the rules radically? So if you've ever been in a brainstorm session, there's rules. Well, do you like those rules? Would you change those rules, and why? And what would that allow you to do? The power of changing rules is significant, and I'm just going to tell you a quick historical story. Dueling in America ended around the 1840s. It stopped being deadly. People still dueled, but it became less and less so. And one of the reasons was that there was a set of rules that guided dueling, which was called the Code Duello. And people had that, and it existed for a millennia. And it basically said, here are the 10 rules of a duel. So in 1840, something changed in the way people kind of thought about duels, which is they realized, well, you might challenge me to a duel. I feel like I have to fight, but I still don't want to die, right? And then you're like, I kind of don't want to die either, but I'm like, I have to challenge you. It's a point of honor. So what happened is around that time, the rules of duels changed, where what would happen is if you challenged me to a duel, you would basically then hand me the rules and be like, you designed the rules for the duel, and that's the duel we'll fight. And so one of the most famous duels that was never fought was a duel that Abraham Lincoln was challenged to, where he was challenged to a duel. He basically was given the rules. He walked away. He decided that he was going to do the duel using federal, broadswords, like the ones that were used during the Revolutionary War, and nobody could get within 8 feet of each other. So they got to the dueling field, and they had these like 4-foot-long, swords, and they couldn't get within 8 feet of each other. And everybody was like, "This is so stupid. Let's just go get a drink. It's 6 a.m. Why not?" So it's like, so that's what they did. They just took off and did that. But what I love about that is it's a great example of how changing the rules can actually, in that case, make it so safe that people might live who might not, but can set and reset the playing field. Set and reset. So get rule curious, get playful, look at games. I was talking to you last night about this, which is that I often, when I spoke at the Harvard Club, they were like, all the questions were about dating, all of them, which is really weird. And they were like, "What do I do to know whether I should be with this person day one?" And I was like, play games with them. Once you kind of play a game with someone, you get a sense of how fair they are, how just they are. Those are the things to kind of begin to play with. So look to games as a way to kind of reset rules. They are structured conversations. Sometimes conversations that are good feel like games. They feel like play. I'm going to do the one last thing, and then we're going to talk, which is that the last thing I want you to get good at is notice scripts that are in a room. So I have a question. Who wants to describe a board meeting to me? Come on. Long table. Somebody else? Boring. Serious. Agenda. Confrontational. Anyone else? Okay. Anyone have this kind of setting a little bit in their mind at all? No? No? So the thing that's really interesting is that our scripts, the way our conversations are set by everything, by the sets that we sit in, the way we're having a conversation now is entirely based on the fact that you're sitting at tables, I'm standing on a stage, I have a microphone, you guys don't. That's a script for the way the conversations go. We need to get really good at noticing scripts and recognizing whether they're the scripts we want to live by. So there are times when you don't want a board meeting to look like that. And yet we have this implicit idea of what things look like, even if we've never experienced them firsthand. So if I were to ask this, what's an AA meeting look like? Coffee. Circle. Yeah. Honest. Yeah, people, it's AA is a really powerful mechanism for conversation or wherever you go. Well, it's so interesting, I don't know if people had something like this in their mind, but this is interesting. You may never have been in a meeting, but you still probably have this because the scripts are set by our cultural understanding. So we've seen this in film after film after film, TV after TV. So we begin to understand what something looks like. We begin to live by those scripts. And every time we just accept a script firsthand or just say, that's okay with me, then we accept something that we may or may not feel like we want to accept. This happens all the time. It's especially apparent when you look in the realm of politics. This is really different than the way Zelensky shows up, right? It's very different. So these scripts can actually tune the way we have conversations in ways that are really significantly negative or positive. And so we want to get good at script spotting. So what I want you to get really good at is notice when you're living by a script, and do you want to live by that script? What's a round table telling you? What's the agenda telling you? What's the fact that, what does it mean that I'm on stage, you're not? What does the long table that Putin's sitting behind mean? Those are the things we start to need to read. And then we start to say, well, wait a second, I don't want that script in this conversation. I want to change it out and change the script entirely, which you can do. And I'll just say it takes work, and we'll talk about this, but I think the number one thing that you have to do to kind of embrace really hard conversations is commit to the people at the table in the conversation and commit to that more than anything else, more than the kind of values you hold, more than other things. When you enter a conversation, to have the hard ones, you have to think about commitment. So with that, I thought we'd just talk, so. Thanks. By the way, you guys keep it really cold in Atlanta. It's really cold.
Can you guys hear me? Yeah. So, funny story. I will not name a name, but somebody walked in at the beginning of the meeting and saw the book, and they said, I don't have any problem talking. The problem I have is being quiet. So how many of you have ever been in a meeting where you've got half the folks that kind of sit back, and then you got a couple that are dominating the conversation, right? So what do we do with conversation dominators?
Well, so there's three things that we're thinking about right now. So it's really, I feel kind of sad about this, which is that one of the number one questions that my clients ask me is like, can you teach me how to cut this person off? And that's like literally, or if you mention, you're like, oh, and we'll teach you how to cut people off. They're like, that's what we need. We'll pay a lot for that. Like, it's like people really want it. And it's interesting, like, so I've had to train people, like I had somebody in the beginning of the pandemic who had to learn how to cut Hillary Clinton off, and she's just like, how do I do it? And so one of the things that we often do is train people to practice. One of the things that we're not very good at is practicing cutting people off who talk or dominate all the time. And so often what I'll ask people to do is look into their own lives, their personal lives, and say, where have you done that? How do you do it? And then how do you practice that and bring that into your daily life? So that's one way. Right now, we're more interested in this idea of people starting to recognize when they themselves are oversharing. So we built this kind of like 2x2 that's basically, here's all the reasons why you might be talking too much, which ends up being a really useful tool just to have on the wall in a meeting. Because once you start to see it, you start to kind of recognize your behaviors. It's a lot easier if somebody recognizes they're talking too much than if you have to actually kind of intercede. So we're trying to play it both ways, teaching people how to cut people off, but also teaching people to recognize when they talk too much.
So the other thing that's happening in a lot of situations these days, because it is so polarized, right? And you've got people who absolutely have to go to this corner or that corner, and we aren't seeming to find that middle ground. You mentioned holding your beliefs lightly.
Yeah.
So what does that mean in practice? What does that look like?
Yeah, it means a couple things. And I think there's actually a really basic practice that I would think about, especially for this group as you go into a series of hard conversations this year. So just a little story on this, which the first time I ever gave this a talk about this, somebody raised their hand and they were like, well, what happens if I just hate somebody right off the bat and I just don't want to talk to them? And I was like, oh yeah, I guess that's a thing. That really happens. And so one of the things I talked about, one of the ideas there was like, and wrote a whole chapter about, which is like, how do you commit to a conversation? How do you commit to the people in the conversation, but hold your values a little more lightly? And so the idea is more that step back from a second and forget about values and holding it lightly. It's more the question, which is that it's like, if you go into a conversation with the agenda of changing people's minds, people feel it and know it immediately. And so I think one of the things that I've been really trying to work with people is recognizing that a hard conversation, an important conversation, a conversation about us in the future of leadership is actually a series of long conversations. It's not just one conversation. So often that we go in being like, I've got this 20 minutes, I'm gonna change a mind. And that basically isn't conversation at all. That's just an agenda that's being set. So the easiest way to do it is to walk into a conversation that you're going to have today with the recognition that maybe you're going to have that conversation again in a week and again in another week, and maybe it'll happen for like a year or two, but you may ultimately get someplace. Whereas if you try to go in immediately and force it using something that you believe really strongly, you lose. It's not a conversation. It's over. And so that's kind of the basis. It's just like, don't go in changing minds right off the bat.
Well, one of the things that struck me about when I read the book about your grandmother's story is that her absolute belief in her story and her personal experience and her willingness to share that resonated with you. You saw the humanity in her, right? And you knew something personal about her. And while you might not hold the same belief, you could value her belief and her experience. And I think that getting to know the person you're in conversation with at the table, it's one of the reasons why I had you all introduce yourselves today, because very often we don't know the person and don't know their story.
Yeah. Well, and I also think as you were doing your introductions today, the idea of being like, here's one thing that you're proud of. So it's like, we may never remember anything else about you, but we'll all remember that you climbed Everest, going, sideways. I mean,
Tyler, Mountain Man.
Yeah, we'll call you Mountain Guy. But it's a really powerful thing to do that, because that little bit of kind of like, let me get insight into this person as a human first, then allows you to kind of go be much more relaxed. Sorry, is it okay? Sorry. Allows you to kind of like really understand why people are doing the things that you do. I also think what's interesting about my grandmother's story is that it's a story of hardworking. It's a story of kind of like what gets you through. Those things we can relate to, even if we don't relate to Jesus winked at me and that got me through. It's like we'd all love that, I think, if we could.
So the other thing is about listening with your body. And I know many employers in the room are, dealing with getting employees back into the office. And how you use that time when you're in the office. And one of the things that struck me after reading the book is that there is so much value that comes from having these meetings in person, because you listen with your whole body and you see what they're doing with their whole body when you're actually in the meeting. And why is that so important?
I think it's because we actually, as sensory beings, we sense way more than we believe we do. Like, we're aware of so much more. I was actually in a meeting in an angry newsroom a while back ago, and I could tell that somebody was making a face, an angry face, behind me, not because I could see the person, but because I could see the person across from her reacting to it. So we have a kind of multisensory ability that is often just kind of like being aware of, I can work off of you to know what this person's thinking over here. We actually work as a large entity. That gets disrupted when we kind of work in a virtual and online context. One of the things that we're really trying to do is get really good at saying what absolutely needs to be in person and what can absolutely be kind of separated and happen for Zoom. I mean, we will live in a hybrid world. That's the way it's going to be. The one thing that I will say, though, is we heard over the last 2 years about so many people who got greater comprehension, greater understanding of their employees, and vice versa, based on seeing the backgrounds of their lives in more real ways. So suddenly, if I saw a CEO have to deal with his child on a Zoom call, I had more empathy for that. And so there's been interesting pros and cons of taking stuff out of the real life and into virtual. So it's a combo. It's an interesting way to, I think you all should be making lists of the places where certain kinds of conversations need to happen in certain kinds of ways, and begin to build your work structures around that. At least that's what we plan to do.
Well, as a longtime doodler, does anybody else doodle when they're listening? So it turns out, thanks to what I read in Fred's book, that you retain about 30% more information if you're a doodler or a knitter or a something. What is not a good distraction, however, is your phone, right? So I think that when we look at rules and constraints and conversations, I think it could be helpful to determine what are the things allowed into the meeting and what are the things that are not allowed.
Yeah, I actually encourage people to set tables together for the conversations they want to have, even if it's a business meeting. So I definitely do it at home, which is, I worked with a mother and daughter who had real problems talking about eating because of the eating disorder. And we tried all kinds of things, like having them set and reset tables together, figure out like ways to eat in different ways. And finally what we realized we had to do is just remove the table from the dining room altogether. It was the only way to allow conversations to happen in a kind of constructive way. You can do the same thing in meetings. One of the moments where actually it's better to not have a table between you all. Like, what happens in a circle when there's not something between you? How often do you go into rooms where the room is haunted by somebody else's ideas and you just have the meeting anyway, right? So the walls are covered with somebody else's thinking, or a podium that was set up for somebody else's talk. Don't do that. Don't let your conversations be haunted by conversations that are not the ones you want to have. Seriously, reset the table for the conversations you want to have. That's true at home and in that workplace.
The other thing that I thought was interesting is how people can, because we do get impatient, there's a lot of type A types in this room, right? And we're always thinking ahead, right? I need to ask this question. I need to get this point across. And what happens in the interim while we're kind of waiting to, even if it's just theoretically raise our hand, we're focusing on what we want to be saying, right? And not what's actually being said.
That's right.
So are there ways to get full participation and kind of pre-stage that so that everybody knows their voice is going to be heard and you don't lose the momentum with people going?
Yeah, I think it's actually, there's a couple things that we do that are really important. And it's even become more critical, which is that as we start to see the increased kind of understanding of neurodivergence in the workforce, which is people who don't feel comfortable speaking perhaps, or may kind of do things that are better by writing. One of the things that we do as a really simple practice is basically take breaks in any conversation and meeting and basically say, no, everybody write their ideas for 5 minutes. So what it does is allows different ways for ideas to be captured in the room, different ways for people to process and think as they do. One of my favorite ways of having conversations, though, is to take away all the tables in a room like this and have you do your conversations on your feet. And so we do a thing called intentions, which is a movement-based conversation. So we'll throw up ideas or issues or things that see polemics on the wall and have you move back and forth based on what's on the wall. So right now I feel more afraid of conversation or more empowered, go back and forth, and have people talk about why. And what's really interesting about that is when you do a room this size, everybody feels like they're participating even if they don't talk. And it's because the act of moving is a way of showing how you feel about something. So we're looking for new ways. It's when I go to talk about games, charades is a really interesting game because all it does is continually eliminate ways of having conversations. So you start to see who's good at using words, who's good at being really brief, who's good at using no words. And those are all ways that we are in the world. And we just have to make way for more ways for us to be.
Well, I love the fact that you mentioned writing. So I'm going to segue for just a second. So on your table are note cards, and one person has a facilitator card closest to them. So whoever that is, just own it, take responsibility, be the leader. But everybody has a note card. So what I want you to think about, and we're also going to let you ask Fred more questions while you're thinking, but what I want everyone to think about is if you knew you were going to be in a safe place, a safe conversation, nobody was going to yell at you or fuss at you or get mad at you for what you might want to know, what is the thing that you really want to learn and understand more about that's going on in our world? Don't tell me crime, right? That's too big. But tell me, why are those guys street racing? I want to understand the psyche behind that. This is like my pet peeve in the neighborhood I live in, right? They're always racing up and down, and I've always wanted to go up to them in their big noisy cars and go, what are you thinking? Why are you doing this? Doesn't have to be street racing. But I want each of you, there's a card for each of you on the table to write down what is a conversation that you would really like to have here in Rotary if you knew we could do it in a safe, productive, kind, compassionate way, right? What is that conversation? Once you write down your thoughts individually, then your facilitator is going to help. You guys are going to decide as a table what are the top two that you want to put forth at your table. So you have to reach some consensus. We're going to use these top two to weave in the course of our year at Rotary. So you guys, because you showed up today and took the time, are going to help set the stage for some of the topics that we dive in over the course of the next year. Now, in the interim, if you've got your thought written down and you want to ask Fred a question about conversations, let the questions go too. And we'll reconvene in a few minutes with your facilitator. Anybody have a question for Fred? Anybody? Danica?
Right.
Yeah, and you guys write silently. You don't have to talk yet.
I'm just curious about the people in the room who stay silent. And my thinking is they've got ideas and they're not sharing them, and it feels like they're sucking the energy out of the room by not.
So the people who stay silent kind of suck the energy out. How do we get them to engage if they're silent?
It's a really great point, and I think what you're aware of then is like the variety of roles. I mean, what's really interesting is that there's like 10 archetypes of way people participate in conversation. There's the quiet person, and then there's the quiet person who you know has something, and that's the one that kind of really throws us off. And that's actually why we try to break things up by sort of being like, okay, right, everybody's going to say something. Or it's like we do go around every once in a while and say, we're going to get 20 seconds for each person. So you just like, you have to be kicking at the different behaviors that are there. But it's like, you have to be cognizant of all of it. When we do our work, we often have somebody who just, their job is to notice what's happening and kind of call it out. So happy to chat more about that.
Has everybody written their thought down on their card? Has everybody written, by a show of hands, has everybody written their thought on their cards?
Wow.
No? Come on, Bob, you got to hurry up. So whoever the facilitator was, at your table has to reach consensus on the two that you're going to put forward for Rotary. Okay? Go. You have a couple of minutes.
Seems like it's perfect.
We'll stay up here and see if
I'm gonna take this off because I feel like it's like keeps bouncing around.
I'm going to be collecting all the cards. I do want your top two identifiable to me, whether that's stars on the card or whatever. But I want your top two that you've reached consensus on to be starred, and we'll get the rest up as well, and we will use those for our year. We have reached the end of our time. Fred has got some books here for sale. They're $20 a pop, if anybody wants one of Fred's books. He's here for a little bit longer. He can answer questions more specifically. I want to be mindful of our time. It is 1:17. That means we're 2 minutes over. I do encourage you to come next week. Darren Scherbaum, who is the interim APD chief, Atlanta Police Department chief, is going to be here with us, sharing his thoughts about what's been happening in Atlanta and what he's going to do going forward and what he has been doing up until this point. But as we all know, summer can be a dangerous time. So I hope you will join me next week with the interim APD chief, and we will hear more about where we're going this coming year in Rotary. I am very gratified to see all the participation and the good conversations, because that's exactly what we want to do through this rest of the year. I am a firm believer that we walk our talk, and walking means that we're actually going to do something, right? We're not just going to talk. So we're going to walk our talk, but we got to learn how to talk with each other as well. This was a great start. I'm feeling energized. I hope you guys are as well. We will collect all the cards, and thank you so much for making my first meeting a lot of fun. Thank you.